Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Hello, everyone. I'm Carol Fleck, and I'm the editor here at Attitude. Thank you for joining today's event called Mental Health Out Loud. This is a new type of conversation for the team at Attitude. Our mission is to bring you information, advice, and insight about the issues that have a profound effect on our lives today. We are delighted to have top experts in the field of ADHD and mental health join us to speak out loud and help us to better understand the world around us. Today, we are here to discuss how prolonged exposure to trauma, anxiety, fear, and stress can affect children's and teen brains, especially in the aftermath of tragedies like the Uvalde, Texas school shootings and reports of increasing gun violence nationwide. Of course, there are other traumatic stressors that plague children. These include homelessness, abuse and neglect, losing a parent, witnessing violence, living in fear of violence, and enduring the effects of systemic racism. Our esteemed expert to guide us today is Dr. Cheryl Chase, a clinical psychologist with a private practice near Cleveland, Ohio. Dr. Chase is here to explain how stress, anxiety, and trauma can impact a child's brain development and function. Prolonged exposure to stress, anxiety, and trauma can lead to attention deficits, working memory problems, and language delays. Research shows that children who suffer traumatic stress are more likely to have learning problems, lower grades, and more suspensions and expulsions in school. The effects of traumatic stress on children can also cause emotional problems, such as impaired mood control, which can lead to explosive behavior and outbursts. It can cause hyperactivity, sleep disruptions, and social challenges in younger and older children. A growing body of research suggests that traumatic stress is closely associated with ADHD. Children with ADHD have higher rates of traumatic stress or adverse experiences than children without ADHD. And not surprisingly, exposure to trauma and toxic stress can cause chronic health conditions as well as mental health problems like depression. And these problems can follow a child all the way through to adulthood. Dr. Chase authored an important must-read article in the upcoming fall issue of Attitude Magazine on the trauma of school violence and how to talk to children of all ages about their fear and anxiety. Dr. Chase specializes in the diagnostic and neuropsychological assessment of ADHD, learning disorders, and other conditions that affect children, adolescents, and young adults. In addition to her clinical practice, Dr. Chase leads workshops on executive functioning and on creative ways to support kids who struggle in school. Before we start our conversation, I just have a few housekeeping items. Those of you tuned in to this live event may submit questions for Dr. Chase at any time by navigating to the text box under the video player. We also have prepared a resource sheet that you can download now by clicking on the Event Resources section of your screen. And if you support the work we're doing here at Attitude, we encourage you to visit attitudemag.com/subscribe and sign up for Attitude Magazine. Subscribe now and you'll receive our fall issue, which also includes articles on bullying, on how to know when to seek intervention for your anxious child, on mapping a sensory profile for your child, and other articles, including, as we mentioned earlier, Dr. Chase's informative piece on how to talk to students about school shootings and other tragedies. Dr. Chase, it's so great to have you here.
Thank you so much, and welcome everyone in our Attitude family. I'm so happy to be back.
So first, help us to understand what defines trauma, stress, and anxiety. What situations or conditions cause these responses? For example, would trauma have to involve a life-altering event, such as witnessing or being a victim of violence? Or would bullying at school be classified as trauma?
So that's a great way to start because I think there's a lot of confusion over these terms. There's a lot of confusion, I think, in popular culture as well. And so, not everything that is stressful is necessarily traumatic. And the other piece is what's traumatic for one person may not be traumatic for another. So let's look at those terms and kind of break them down a little bit. When we're talking about stress, stress is just any kind of mental or emotional strain that you would experience as a result of some kind of challenge. Now, there can be good stress, like bringing home a new baby or planning your wedding, or there can be bad stress, like my boss is always, on my back, or I have 3 midterms this week and I'm not doing well in any of my classes. So stress in and of itself is simply just that sort of reaction that you have to a heavy event that's coming up or that you're anticipating. Biological organisms, humans, we can grow better as a result of the right kind of stress. The wrong kind of stress can actually have a significant impact, which is what we'll be talking about the rest of the hour. Anxiety is your response to the stresses that are in your life, real or not real or sort of in your mind. But nonetheless, the body doesn't know the difference, and the body can experience an anxiety response, sort of this heightened, stressful sense of danger or impending doom, that something bad's about to happen or something bad might happen if I don't XYZ. Now, again, a little bit of anxiety can actually be a good thing. A little bit of anxiety can help an athlete put out their best performance and get all 10s from the judges. A little bit of anxiety can result in a musician playing better or in an athlete performing better. A little bit of anxiety will get your teenager to study for those 3 midterms in the same week rather than just letting it go. And a little bit of anxiety will keep you focused on driving your car instead of kind of laying back and looking out your window at all the other things around you. So some anxiety is normal and healthy. It's too much that's a problem. And now trauma. Trauma is this significant emotional kind of shock that we have following either one stressful event or a variety or a series of smaller stressful events. And so the researchers that talk about trauma kind of break it up. So there's a level 1 or a type 1 trauma, which is one big significant event happened and I'm in the midst of that aftermath. A tornado, a witnessing of a school shooting, perhaps being shot in a school shooting. Some of those major things that I think the majority of us would really agree that was traumatic. Then a type 2 might be a shorter duration, but it's still longer than just boom, one event. So it may be that we had a hurricane, it lasted 4 days, and then a week later we had another hurricane. So it may not be a specific lightning bolt intense event, but it was lower level for a longer period of time and still pretty significant. The third type is a type that's a little bit more sneaky. The third type would be these repeated situations that come up over and over again, particularly in childhood, that can affect the person long term. And we call that a complex trauma. So that might be things like repeated bullying by classmates, by teachers, by administrators. That could be low-level emotional abuse in the home. Now, low-level meaning there's no bruising, there's no significant things that a teacher might say, I wonder, but it's that kind of low-grade enough. Things like chronic poverty, chronic hunger, systemic racism. These are all things that absolutely can lead to a complex trauma response in a human. Now, not every event that is significant will create a trauma response in everyone. There are other factors. So whether there's a protective, helpful adult in that child's life that can mitigate the impact of the stressor, whether there are other resources available. So is there a church family that was there to be able to help after the tornado? Or were the first responders available to come at the time of the fire and take the family away intact and healthy and safe? So what those other things are, what their other kind of resources are, can define whether or not Susie has a traumatic response to an event. But Tommy, it seems to just kind of roll off of his back. And divorce is a classic example of that. Some kids you see significantly impacted by divorce, and other kids don't have as near of a significant impact.
So divorce can actually be a trauma for kids?
Divorce can be a trauma for kids. It usually takes the form of the ongoing conflict. So the research shows that it's not just divorce that can be stressful for kids or traumatic for kids. It's the ongoing conflict between the parental figures. If the parents can figure out how to manage their conflict, usually I think by getting a coach and working through it with a divorce coach, the children fare much better. It's the ongoing kind of lower to moderate level aggression, anxiety, stress, tension. And I've actually seen it in my practice, even as old as teenagers who just feel like they're constantly sitting on a powder keg at home. And it's, whatever home they're in, because if I say one thing to mom, then dad's going to have a huge reaction. If I say something to dad, then mom's going to have a huge reaction, and they feel like their hands are tied.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about trauma, actually, let me go back for a moment. Tell us how these conditions affect teen and children's brains. So does prolonged exposure to trauma and chronic stress change the structure and the function of the brain? And how do these changes manifest in a child's day-to-day life in school, in relationships, in social situations?
Sure. That really is what it all boils down to, right? Is what is the impact and how is this impacting these humans? And I am going to talk primarily about children, but I will expand when it comes to adults when I think it kind of fits. We talk about under the age of 18, children experiencing what are known as ACEs, aversive childhood experiences. And so researchers have kind of categorized them. And there can be things like divorce. There can be things like bullying. There can be things like chronic hunger. So these events build up and add up over time. And so it really may be, as I said, it might not be that sort of one straw that broke the camel's back that really led to whatever this child's behavioral issues are at school. But yes, chronic stress absolutely impacts the brain or can impact the brain. And I want to use an example that I use when I work with parents. So think of the brain. I know this is going to sound weird, but go with it, as a peach. So you've got the pit in the middle of the peach, and you've got that fleshy stuff around the outside of the peach, the stuff that you eat, the fruity part. The pit of the peach is analogous to our lower brain centers, the parts of the brain kind of behind your mouth at the top of your neck here in the back at the brainstem that are responsible for things that keep us alive. Heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, pupil dilation, those sorts of things that pretty much all animals have to do. The higher brain centers, the fleshy part of the peach, the part that you would eat if you were eating a peach, I want you to think of that more like the higher order brain centers, the parts of the brain that are responsible for things like problem solving or shifting from one set of thoughts to another, or going into long-term memory so that you can use hindsight and you can use forethought. The base part of the brain, the pit part of the brain, and the fleshy part of the brain work together most of the time. But under stress, guess what? The survival wins. The survival parts of the brain, the lower brain stem, so the parts that are responsible for breathing, respiration, heart rate, pupil dilation, they actually get more resources. And the higher parts of the brain are getting less resources because we are in survival mode. We're going to run away from whatever the threat is. We're going to fight whatever the threat is. We're hyper aware of all the sounds and smells around us because we're trying to be aware of what the other threats are out there. We're in survival mode. Not only are the lower brain centers getting more fuel, but there are also toxic chemicals or unhealthy, stressful chemicals that are being dumped into the bloodstream. And some of those will bathe the brain. So the peach, fleshy part of the peach isn't getting as much resources and is getting kind of bathed in this adrenaline and cortisol. And that can have a long-term effect on the development of the brain. So if you think about children, when they're born, the pit is pretty much intact. We are able to regulate our temperature and breathe and digest and things like that within a few days of being born, often at birth. It's this stuff that develops over time, the fleshy part of the peach that develops over time. And as you take a developing brain and you stress a developing brain, the parts that are most stressed are the development of those higher order problem solving, thinking, reasoning, planning, organization. So you can see a child who may be going along relatively adjusted appropriately. I see it in international adoptees. The parents at age 3 or 4 are feeling pretty good about this child and their progress, their development of English, their development of physical milestones, for example. But then in the middle school years or the high school years, there are significant pockets of problem. So in other words, parents will tell me it's like Swiss cheese. They're going along just fine. And then there's a huge chasm in problem solving, hindsight, forethought, things like that. So from a developmental standpoint, we absolutely can see problems with those executive functions when those are expected to be online. We don't expect a kiddo in 2nd grade or 3rd grade to manage their locker or do a long-term project. But by 7th or 8th grade, we expect those things, and that's when we might see the problem. So that's one way that we can see kind of a delayed effect of stress on a developing brain. But there are other things. We know that the stress can impact, and the chemicals being released and things can impact memory. It can impact learning. The parts of the brain, the hippocampus that are responsible for learning and memory, they can be smaller. The prefrontal cortex can actually have some shrinkage and be smaller. That's the part of the brain for long-term thinking, planning, organization. We also see an imbalance in the different types of brain cells there are. So there's the gray matter, which is the stuff that really kind of makes up the neuron. And then there's the white matter, which is the bridges that connect the cells to each other. So we actually see an imbalance of that. There should be more gray than white, and we can actually see that there's more white than we would expect in a brain that's been through a lot of trauma. And that has to do with timing and connections of different parts of the brain. And that's what researchers are pretty certain is leading to an increase in mental health issues in folks who have chronic stress, because the communication networks are just not healthy.
So how does this manifest in a child's day-to-day life? In school, in terms of the child's emotions, social relationships? How do we see it play out?
What we often see is a child who is, one of those kids who has been susceptible and exposed. So first of all, we talk about the biopsychosocial approach, by the way. So you might be born with a certain biological predisposition, but never experience a major stressor. And so you go on with life just fine. But someone else born with that same predisposition may have lost a grandparent at a young age and been through divorce and experienced multiple moves so if they have the biological predisposition and the social events and the stressors without the buffers like a parent who's there and available to help you manage your emotions and things, those kids can then go on to manifest irritability, impulsivity, not caring about grades or not caring at school. Or they may be at school and their intentions are good, but remember I was talking about the pit and the fleshy part of the peach? If the pit is in charge, the fleshy part isn't really very available. So the example I use is, I'm so busy worrying about the next threat, I don't have the brain power to solve for X right now in my algebra class. Or younger kids, again, the lower brain center, we're wired for survival. We're talking about a brain that's listening and hearing and sensing everything around it. But you want that student to sit and work on a worksheet. And they're having a hard time drilling down and focusing on any one thing because they are wired right now. They're in a brain activated situation where they are looking for and being aware of the threats around them because their brain doesn't know the difference between you're just in school and you're safe here, and anybody who's talking about you behind your back or throwing a spitball at you or something, that's not a physical threat. The brain doesn't know it. It handles everything like a physical threat. So we end up with kids who can be hyperactive. Does sound familiar? Can have a hard time managing their impulses, can be emotionally dysregulated. They can have difficulty holding in mind a lot of information at the same time. So you give them a five-step directions and they remember the first and the last. So working memory is impacted. And they can also have difficulty with social relationships, avoiding other people. They can be really irritable with siblings and family. They can be really withdrawn.
So the piece about schoolwork, what are educators to do in a situation like that? And how do you discern between having ADHD, for example, or, how is a teacher to know that a child is going through or has had this trauma and this is the result, and does the distinction even make a difference in terms of the accommodations that are required or needed?
And great question. Yep. So teachers will ask me this a lot. I do a lot of speaking nationally and internationally. And whenever I speak about ADHD, I will inevitably get, especially from certain districts that I'm thinking of, where they have a much poorer population or more minorities in their populations. And there's a group that I work with down on the Texas-Mexico border. And the teachers there will repeatedly ask me, how am I supposed to know if this kid has ADHD? How am I supposed to know if this kiddo has dyslexia? And my answer is you don't, and you won't. And as a classroom teacher, a special ed teacher, a gen ed teacher, you may never know the true answer to that. But the point remains that there are things that you can do to address the needs of the child in front of you in that moment right now. I say, the diagnosticians, the clinicians, the psychologists, the school psychologists, we're the ones, these are my people, that we're in the nitty gritty trying to sort out. So is it trauma? Is it ADHD? Is it both? Is it also a learning disorder? And, we're the ones taking our little sort of diagnosing Bibles and DSMs and tabbing them, and because it is a muddy picture. But the good news is that as a classroom teacher, what I tell folks is there are basically 5 or 6 things that you can do that will support a stressed brain in your classroom. And who cares why that stress is there? It may be because dad was yelling at mom this morning. It may be because I didn't sleep at home last night. I slept, in a car or in a parking lot. I don't know what the stressors are. For some, it could just be, I'm nervous about this test I have today. But there are 5 things that I tell teachers. The first one is simplify your language. Simplify your language. Don't add parenthetical phrases. Don't talk too much. Just keep it simple directions, one step at a time. The second one is show and tell. So if you're going to give a set of steps or instructions, write them down. That's a lot to hold in mind when you're stressed out. Or better yet, if possible, use picture lists. So I'm going to show you this thing that I have. I don't know if you can see it. It's a clean your bedroom list. So they're all over the internet, but you can do it. So it's got, it has a couple of words and then has a picture of what to do. So teachers show and tell at the same time. Steps for a long division problem, write them down so they can follow those steps instead of having to hold all those steps in mind while doing them. The third one is externalize important information. And this is straight out of all the ADHD literature and research. Those of you in my Attitude family, I know we all know who Russ Barkley is. He talks about externalizing everything. I want to show you a couple of the things that I use when I'm talking and speaking. This is a time timer. It externalizes time so that it gets smaller as time passes and the kids can see how much time they have left to work on a project. So that's a way to externalize time. You can externalize important information like, I don't know, a little times table. They can just keep it at their desk, or there's fractions or number lines. So any important information, just externalize it, because it's really hard to hold information in mind, like how to spell commonly misspelled words, or what are my multiplication facts. That stuff is difficult to hold in mind and to retrieve when you're in the midst of problem solving. So externalize for them. The fourth thing is keep routines. Keep things low stress, consistent, regular routines. Some people make the mistake of thinking that we got to mix it up because it'll keep the kids excited and keep them engaged. Actually, it's the direct opposite. We want to keep things calm and predictable at school as much as possible. And then the last one is there's really great research on using mindfulness techniques. So ways of bringing the body back down. Now, remember I was talking about the pit and the peach. We used to believe that, when the pitch activated, and there's not much we can do. But we're learning now that, in fact, we can exert some control over those pit features of the brain, heart rate, blood pressure, those sorts of things. Mindfulness is a really good way. And it's just about shrinking your world into the here and the now and the moment. And there are practices. There's 1-minute mindfulness techniques, 5-minute mindfulness techniques, simple breathing. So I'm going to share one with you that I do. I worked on this with my own children from the time that they were born. I do this with all my patients. I do it when I'm testing, and I do it all the time myself. So you breathe in, then you hold, then you exhale, then you hold. And it's called box breathing. So you can breathe in for a count of whatever works for you. I like 3, then I hold for 3, then I exhale for 3, and then I hold for 3. So it's and then you can do 3 or 4 of those box breaths. But there are lots of mindfulness techniques. If you just Google 5-minute mindfulness techniques for the classroom. And I'll tell you a little side note. My son is 15. They have been doing mindful minutes at his school for years. And I see a huge difference in him versus his brother and sister. So summarize, simplify your language, show and tell, externalize information, keep routines, and practice mindfulness techniques.
So these are primarily things you can do at school, although mindfulness you can certainly do at home. What are some other strategies that parents can use at home or caregivers can use at home?
Yeah, I adapt these 5. So same kind of thing. You don't want to talk too much. You don't want to kind of assault with a lot of language. If a child's been through something stressful recently, by all means, you want to create space for your child. What that means is be available, don't pry, but say, hey, I'm here, I'm good. Whenever you want to chat, I'm available. Or, hey, do you want to go for an ice cream? Hey, do you want to connect somehow? Hey, you want to watch a movie together? There are things that you can do to make the child know that you're ready and available, and you're not going to pry for information. You're not going to ask them a lot about whatever the traumatic event or events were. The term that we use in our field is holding space. And what it means is you don't show up with your agenda. You just show up and say, hey, I'm here. And this awkwardness, this kind of weirdness that I know there might be some tension between my kiddo and me right now. I'm not going to mention it. I'm not going to bring it up. I'm not going to talk about it. I'm just going to say, hey, I'm here. We call that holding space. And whatever you're thinking and feeling is fine. Once you're through that acute piece, certainly being available to help them sort through their emotions, what they're thinking and feeling. So things like what we call active listening, like, sounds like that was a really big experience for you. Or what I hear you saying is that you tried to run the other way, but you weren't sure which way to go. So don't be afraid to let them tell their story and listen, but don't try to sweep in and fix it and correct it and say, avoid things like, well, at least, or it could have been worse, right? And you can just reflect back to them what you hear. Sounds like you were feeling kind of nervous when you were sitting on the floor in that room, right? So things like that. But simplifying your language, when you ask them to do something, when you're kind of working with them to, hey, I need you to empty the dishwasher. Hey, I need you to pick up your room. Like, I know you've been through a lot, but we still have some things we need to do. Frame it that way. Hey, I know you got a lot on your mind, but we still need to be out of the house by 7 for school tomorrow morning. How can I help you so that we're out the door on time? If it gets to the point where getting up in the morning is challenging, then it might be time to get some professional help. Externalizing important information. So I know, for example, as a mom, I went through a divorce when my kids were younger. Obviously not something I planned for, something I ever wanted in my life. But what I found is that we ended up moving kind of quickly. Like one night, boom, left our house and we're living in another house. And I had to do all I could to externalize for the kids. Hey, here's your morning routine. I wrote it all down for each of the 3 because there were different ages and different routines. Hey, here's your bedtime routine. So that even in the midst of all the turmoil, they could count on the systems and the routines that they were used to. And I externalized them with pictures and words so that the kids didn't have to pull it up in their own minds or call on me, who was also going through some stress. And then, yes, the mindfulness techniques, absolutely. And in fact, one of the things I like to add too is don't ever use timeout as a punishment. Timeout should never be a punishment. Timeout is what good self-regulators do to get themselves back in order. So model using timeout. Hey guys, I need a timeout. I always say, mom's going for timeout. I need to take my 20. And my family knows, like, I'm pulling it back together before we start whatever the next barrage of the day is going to be. But model that for your kids and encourage them as well. Hey, looks like maybe a little timeout is going to be helpful here. Not a threat. Is just a way to pull away from all the stimulation around you, gather your thoughts, do some mindful breathing, and then get back into the world.
You know, we talk about reward versus punishment a lot. And, you know, it seems that more and more research and educators and professionals come down on the side of reward, positive reinforcement. Does this differ with a stressed brain? Should you never punish with a kid who's really under stress and who's been traumatized? Does that thinking shift? You want someone to have consequences for a particular behavior, or you want to motivate someone to do something specific, but does that change with a stressed brain?
That's going to be an awfully nuanced answer. Mm-hmm. Because I'm thinking of a few things. The first thing is it would depend on the kiddo, it would depend on the age, and it would depend on the trauma or the stress that the child has gone through. But children need consistency, and they need to know that their poor choices will meet with consequences. Always you want to catch them being good. You want to try to stroke and reward and reinforce what they're doing when they're doing it as much as possible, if it's something you want to see more of. So the rule of thumb is you reward what you want to see more of, and then you punish, if you must, what you want to see less of. However, use punishment very, very sparingly. So there's two types of punishment. There's going to be positive punishment and negative punishment. Positive punishment, don't let the name fool you. It's not a good thing. Positive punishment will decrease the likelihood that whatever they just did is going to happen again. So your kid swore at you. Positive punishment means you add something aversive. You hit them. Negative punishment is decreasing the likelihood that they'll swear again, because that's what the term punishment means. But it means we're taking away something that they want. So you can add something they don't want or take away something they do want. Positive punishment is when you add something they don't want, avoid it. Avoid it. If you add something aversive, guess what? You're increasing negative affect. You're increasing the crappy feelings between the two of you, and you're increasing their sense of victimization and traumatization. If you take away something that they want, something that they've liked, I avoid that whenever possible. I'd rather dangle a carrot in front of them. Hey, I heard you swear. I know you have better words for that. Instead of the word that you chose to use, let's come up with other words that you might be able to use. Okay, those are all permitted for me. So in the future, when I see you get upset, if you use one of those better choice words, that's awesome. You're going to earn whatever extra time on your iPad, or you're going to earn. So the first infraction or the first time your child does something that you're not real fond of, I just call them out on it, depending on what it is, you know, how extreme it is. I was talking to somebody the other day who said, Dr. Chase, I have had to fix 7 holes in my walls in the last 2 weeks. Okay, so a situation like that, your child is putting holes in your wall. Your child is cutting. Your child is doing things that create damage. Then you set a boundary. You are angry, and I completely understand that you're angry. So you validate the emotion, but the behavior that I see as a result of that emotion needs to stop. But I'm saying simplify your language. So here's how it goes. Hey, I get it. You're pretty stressed out right now. And you may not put holes in the wall. So the word "and" is a better bridge. If you say "but," you're basically saying everything I just said I didn't really mean. So it sounds like this. I get it. You're really stressed out. Anything I can do to help you with being stressed out, please let me know. And we have to find a better way for you to care or to share when you're angry. Putting holes in the wall is not allowed. So do you hit them for putting a hole in the wall? Absolutely not. Do you take away privileges of driving the car this weekend? Perhaps. But I think a better result is you teach them something to do instead. You validate the feeling and then you make them fix it.
Wow, those are great strategies, a great script, really helpful. Are children with ADHD more prone to stress? And also, is there a certain demographic or ethnic group that is more vulnerable to changes in brain development and function due to prolonged exposure to stress and trauma? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So ADHD has a very intimate and, again, nuanced relationship to trauma. So what we know is that if I were to take a 20-year-old who has been diagnosed with ADHD, who we know kind of fits that diagnosis, the doctor put it on that child, that young adult, I can ask that child, did you have a significant number of aversive childhood experiences? And the likelihood of their answer will be, yes, I had several. So we know that people with ADHD, if you look back at their history, there's a high likelihood they have experienced multiple aversive childhood events. We also know that folks with ADHD have a higher likelihood of going forward experiencing negative, stressful events. So I just found this study in 2007. They took 24 kids, so it's not that many, but and they looked at the way their brain was functioning. The lead researcher of the study, Professor Vance Vance, noted that children with ADHD have a decreased ability to cope with stress and will do whatever they can to feel in control. That may result in, guess what, being oppositional. So they'll control what they can. And so it is a delicate relationship because not only are kids who are diagnosed with ADHD likely to have had traumatic experiences in the past, they're also more likely to find themselves in traumatic situations moving forward. So your question about sort of certain demographic groups and absolutely. So what we do know is that all of those same sorts of risk factors. So risk factors are like these red flags and they just accumulate. One risk factor or two risk factor, you may or may not have a problem. When you start getting 6, 7, 8 of these risk factors, that's when we may start to have an issue. What we know is that poverty is a big risk factor for stress and for ADHD and for trauma. We know that children of color tend to experience greater traumatic events in childhood, more of them, and more often live in poverty. And we know that children of parents, if one or both had any mental health issues, they also have an increased likelihood of trauma and stress and not really having a parent there to help them work through those big feelings of childhood. So they're sort of left to their own. And that's one of the things that's really been of personal interest to me is these children who go through stressful events, because guess what? We all go through stressful events. What we need in childhood is an adult to co-regulate that with us. So as we're experiencing these big feelings, maybe we have to move. Maybe my best friend doesn't go to school with me anymore. Maybe there were gunshots outside the window yesterday. So depending on how stressful the situation is, in fact, I'm reading a book right now, and the gentleman talks about just going from foster home to foster home and constantly being hungry. And then the bullying and kind of racism that he experienced in the different schools he would go to. He never had one consistent, the term is a charismatic adult, who he could kind of present in front of and say, like, I had a really crappy day. And that adult then comes in and kind of shapes around that, holds that space again and says, sounds like you had a really crappy day. What's going on? And they help you regulate your feelings. In the absence of a good co-regulator, a solid, charismatic adult, just one, it can be a teacher, it can be a coach, it can be a parent, it can be an older sibling. Without that one person, we know that the likelihood of going on to have positive outcomes goes down. So the likelihood of negative outcomes, incarceration, early, drug use, unplanned pregnancies, car accidents, and things like that goes up. So the presence of at least one charismatic adult is another protective factor.
In the absence of that, do these children, are they more likely to develop mental health disorders in childhood and then as they become adults and through adulthood?
Yes. So we know that those who experience multiple chronic or multiple of these aversive childhood events, these ACEs, have a higher likelihood of developing mental health issues, have a higher likelihood of developing, learning and attention issues that can then lead to underachievement in life, underachievement academically. So the multiple ACEs is one huge predictor, one big predictor of those bad outcomes that we don't want, like academic underachievement, dropping out of school, ending up in jail, ending up with heart disease, ending up with mental health issues like bipolar or borderline personality or things like that. But yes, even without a ton of those ACEs, without having the charismatic adult, the one protective factor adult in your life, those folks do, even with fewer ACEs, still have a higher likelihood of going on to all those negative outcomes. Yep.
Well,
yeah. So one charismatic adult can make a massive difference.
mm-hmm. You talked about mindfulness and calming strategies earlier. Do strategies like that and even interventions like cognitive behavioral therapy, can they slow or reverse changes in brain development? Or are there other kinds of therapies or interventions that might be best for treating children with these issues?
Sure. So I've not seen a specific study that talks about sort of pre-testing and post-testing brains, like putting them in a scanner or something, and then putting them through a course of CBT or mindfulness, specifically to look at the trauma indicators. What I do know is that cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, which is a specific type of cognitive behavioral therapy, these mindfulness practices, they do show improved attention. They do show improved learning and memory. They do show improved working memory. So in terms of the neuroanatomy, if that has been studied, I'm not aware. In terms of the way the brain functions, yes. And in fact, that's one of the reasons I really focus on testing and assessment at my office. That's my love, is kind of taking this kiddo and spending a few hours with them, getting to know the families, getting to know the teachers a little bit, getting all this data and formulating a picture in a 20-page document of what is up with this youngster and what they need to be successful. I have recently started branching into the treatment part because I was floored by how effective mindfulness is. And the research is showing that it's super effective for trauma background. It's super effective for ADHD diagnosis. When you find something that can work for an ADHD diagnosis, you do it. Because I know a lot of the kids that I serve can't go on medication. And so, or haven't had a good effect. So certainly I know mindfulness, the dialectical behavioral therapy, and DBT is like, it takes the mindfulness and the cognitive behavioral therapy and puts them together. And then the cognitive behavioral therapies absolutely can kind of stop the ongoing stress and re-traumatization and can get the child kind of functioning better. If a child has a diagnosis of ADHD, it's really tough to go in there and just stop the impulsivity. It's kind of what the brain does. But mindfulness gives them a chance to have better control over their brains.
Mm-hmm. How about resilience? What role does resilience play in this? Does resilience act as a sort of resistance to changing brain structures? Is it protective for children? Is a child who's more resilient less apt to have brain changes and changes in function, daily function?
So resilience is an interesting term, and we've been talking about it more and more because everybody wants it, right? We all have stressful lives, and we all want to be able to handle the stress in a way that doesn't break us. But I was part of a panel a few weeks ago, and one of the panelists had talked about this concept of anti-fragility. And what he was saying is that biological organisms, humans being one of them, we actually can grow better as a result of stress. So when we talk about resilience, right, we have a coffee cup, my ever favorite US Open tennis coffee cup, right? If I dropped this thing, I would cry, and I would take my cup and I would try to glue it back together, but it would never really quite be the same. So it wasn't really that resilient. If I drop it and it bounces and I pick it up and it's fine, wow, it was pretty resilient because it's exactly the way it was before I dropped it. Now, the term anti-fragility is a little bit different. With this, what we're saying is that under stress, biological organisms can actually adapt and be better equipped to handle that stressor in the future. So a certain level of stress, like when we work out, we are stressing our muscles. Why? Because we want our muscles to build stronger. They build back stronger. If you break a bone, you've probably heard this before, that bone actually grows back stronger than it was before it was broken. So on the one hand, I absolutely encourage folks to talk about the term resilience. In fact, I pulled an article that I wrote a couple of years ago about resilience in adults with dyslexia. And it was all about resilience. I hadn't even heard the term anti-fragility before. And what we know is there's a handful of things that can help protect the person from a significant negative outcome from stress. So first of all, this anti-fragility resilience thing definitely can help the person so that on the backside of whatever stresses they've been experiencing, they come out better or at least the same. Certainly, that's what resilience is super important for. And in fact, there's a book, I don't have it right at my fingertips. It's just jumping in my head now as a reminder. Why Children Succeed or How Children Succeed. And it talks about grit and determination. A charismatic adult is it the school system, and it walks you through. It's sort of written like a really long news article. Fascinating about what the variables are for children who've been under extreme stress. But let me just give you a quick summary. So I came up with 10 things that foster resilience. Making connections with other people. So that could be church, that could be a youth group, that could be chess club, whatever. Avoid seeing crises as these insurmountable problems. So keep focused on, I have a midterm in Spanish. I'm not going to flunk out of school. I have a midterm in Spanish. So keep it kind of focused. Accept that change is a part of life. Change is going to happen. And parents, adults, if we posture that, yeah, that's kind of a crappy situation. I'm sorry that you have to go through that. And I'm sure you're going to do great because change is a part of life. Move forwards towards your goal. Do one thing to work towards a goal every day. Look for opportunities of self-discovery. Nurture a positive point of view. Maintain a hopeful outlook. And then our favorite, self-care. Self-care is critical when it comes to times of stress. So I know, like as a mom, when my 3 kids were going through difficult times, be it divorce related, be it exams at school, any of those sorts of things, I encourage them. Hey, take a hot bath. Hey, come on, we're going to go for a walk. Hey, and so my oldest is in the police academy, and the first couple months of school of the academy, I made his meals and took him over and put him in the freezer. Caring for one another, having these charismatic adults around you, and engaging in self-care, allowing yourself an evening to go to bed at 7 o'clock. Those things are critical when it comes to managing stressors in life, especially if it's a heavy, big, acute stressor like divorce or those other things.
Great. So we have lots of great questions from listeners.
Great.
So I'll ask some now. So one is, does trauma cause ADHD, which you talked about, amplify ADHD or mimic it? Is it possible to tell which came first, trauma, which then negatively affected brain development and resulted in ADHD-like symptoms, or the ADHD, which made you more vulnerable to trauma and anxiety?
That's a fantastic question. Wow. So the research is pretty clear that ADHD is its own thing. Can repeated traumas or a high number of ACEs under the age of 18 result in a picture that looks a lot like ADHD? Absolutely. So what I tell, and this is kind of back to what we were talking about maybe half hour or 40 minutes ago, this idea that maybe you don't know why or how the child ended up looking so inattentive, hyperactive, impulsive in front of you. But the strategies that you'll use would be the same. So from a researcher standpoint, from a clinician standpoint, is it possible to tell? It should be possible to tell whether the child is the way that they are because of ADHD, trauma, both, or something else. Because you're looking at a timeline and you're looking at genetics, you're looking at family history, you're looking at all these other variables. But we are pretty clear that trauma has its host of outcomes and is usually tied to a specific event or series of events. And that ADHD is this neurobiological genetic thing. And that repeated traumas won't cause ADHD, but repeated traumas can absolutely look a ton like ADHD. So the interventions and the treatments that I would be recommending to teachers and things in the classroom would pretty much be the same. Is it possible to tell? Yes. It's not always obvious or easy. And what I tell, so during the pandemic, I was getting a lot of referrals for this sort of thing. And I was not comfortable giving an ADHD diagnosis to all these cases that were coming in. What I was often going with was an adjustment disorder or an acute stress response and saying, let's give it 6 months and revisit the question, whether it's ADHD or not. In the meantime, here's everything that you should be doing, which, by the way, is everything you'd be doing if the diagnosis was ADHD. The only thing might be from a medication perspective, you might try something different, but I don't prescribe. But that's something that I tell them, don't go to your psychiatrist and say, I have ADHD, give me a stimulant. Because if this is a trauma response, we probably would not want to stimulate that brain.
We have a few questions from teachers. The first question, taking into account that teachers have limited resources, what are some of the best practices that teachers can use to help students with trauma on a daily basis? Are there techniques or activities we can do in the classroom that help kids with undiagnosed trauma, but that are good for all children? I know you talked about the mindfulness and the directions, and are there other strategies that are good for the whole class as well?
Certainly. The reason that I love talking to teachers about these sorts of things is because I can assure them that the things I'm going to recommend for you are probably good for all the brains in your classroom. We're not just talking about the kids with ADHD, with whatever. So the mindfulness techniques, certainly number one, is the first place I would start. Just add a mindful minute. Even if you just do it before the kids are going to sit down and do some sustained silent reading, or if you're going to do it before everybody has an exam, take a test, do your weekly spelling test or something. And as I said, you can just Google mindful minutes or 5-minute mindfulness activities for the classroom, and tons of things show up. There's PDFs you can print out and all of that. Other things, I know someone had asked me about these kind of cool down spots in the classroom. I love that idea. You can have a little cool down kit where every student brings in a brown bag 2 or 3 items from home, nothing of high value, that they find soothing or calming. Might be a piece of fabric, might be a picture. I've had kids bring in candles that they never light just for the smell, a bar of soap because it has a really good smell. So kids can have those sorts of things. So like I said, at home, don't make time out a punishment. At school, going to your cool down kit is not a punishment. Like, hey, we're all going to take a 5-minute cool down. We have a big test coming up, or before before assembly, where we're going to be sitting in the gym for 45 minutes, everybody take 5 minutes with your cool down kit. So that's another good kind of bring you back to where you are and focus and center you. I also, when I speak on this, I kind of have a list of things that I suggest, and I'll just run through those. The first one is make sure that you have realistic expectations. So if as a cohort, your whole class is going through a lot of stress, or if you know there's a subset of kids in your class who've gone through a lot of stress, or if you know one particular student has gone through a lot of stress, Alter your expectations. So maybe we don't have to rewrite our spelling words 12 times each word or 6 times each word. Maybe we can just make it 3 times each word. Or maybe we can break it up so that you've got 3 nights to get this done instead of 1 night to get it done. Give a lot of movement breaks, getting up, moving around, get the wiggles out, whatever you want to call it. Use multiple modalities for instruction. So like I said, show and say. Let them do projects around what they're interested in. So bring in their interests as much as possible. Divide assignments into smaller segments. Allow for shorter work periods, like 5 minutes or 8 minutes instead of 20. And talk to the child about what is making them anxious or uncomfortable at school in a way that's appropriate. And then finally, structure the timing of the day in a way that makes sense. So if you have kids who've been through some trauma or kids who the morning is very stressful, allow their first period of the day to be a class that it's okay if they're not there for, or a class that it's okay if they miss.
Here's a second question from a teacher. I've had students, especially in high school or middle school, who refuse to take advantage of support that is offered. They don't want to be seen going to a resource room, for example. Do you have suggestions for how to deal with this?
I get this question a lot about teenagers. And I'll tell you, the one thing that I think that works fantastically is don't single them out for whatever the accommodation or intervention is. Everybody do it. So one of the examples that I get is making sure, so it may be a recommendation on mine or someone else's report. Check the student's planner to make sure that they've written in the homework correctly. And what that means is then the student has to go up to the teacher at the end of class with their little planner and say, hey, this is what I wrote in for homework today. Did I write that in correctly? And the teacher initials it, right? It's a common thing that we do. This is really, learning management systems and things like that. And so a couple of students would get really frustrated because they're the only ones that had to do it. I have to keep the planner and I have to. So the whole school adopted a planner. Everybody gets a planner. And everybody on their way out walks past Mrs. Smith's desk and she checks to make sure that they wrote the homework in the right box, the right amount of homework, the right pages or whatever. So whenever possible, instead of pulling that one student for the support or accommodation, make it universal whenever possible. The second thing is the student will get buy-in. You'll get buy-in from that student when they believe that this is something that will actually help the problem. So they have to understand that there is some sort of issue. They have to understand exactly how this intervention helps with that issue. And they have to believe it and they have to see it. So it may start with really simple things that you do so they can see concrete examples of it working. A lot of students say it's a whole lot to go through and it doesn't work anyway. And so you want to start out small. You want to get their buy-in. You want to talk with them about what they see as their struggles and challenges and what they think might work. Many students will resist if they feel something is being thrust upon them. But if you can have a conversation with them and open up a dialogue with them, they're more likely to buy in.
Mm-hmm. It's a great ideas. Another question is, what is the best starting point to seek help for a child with ADHD who is struggling with managing stress or trauma? Would you suggest counseling or training for parents first, or services to help the child as a starting point?
Both. Absolutely both. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, because the child might learn, depending on the age of the child. So I'm thinking, an 8-year-old, you take them into the waiting room and some doctor takes them off to their office for 45 minutes and plays, games with them and teaches them some deep breathing techniques and then brings them back to you and you go home for a week. That's only going to get you so far. But if the parents come in and the parents are taught, like, what are the signs and symptoms of anxiety and stress when your child is being oppositional or crying or throwing themselves on the floor, this is probably why, and this is how you can handle that. So they get some coaching in vivo so that in the moment, in the live environment, they know what to do. You're going to get a lot further, but it's only, depending on the age of the child, the level of oppositionality and things like that, I think both at the same time. And that's usually the model that I have followed, is that both parents and the child are receiving the therapy together So the parents know exactly what to be doing at home. They have some coaching when the behavior gets challenging. And then we all have a unified vocabulary when we talk about box breathing or when we talk about visualization, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, unfortunately, we're running out of time. So, Dr. Chase, I just want to thank you so much for being here today and for lending your thoughtful expertise to this important conversation. To everyone listening, we thank you for joining us. The replay of today's conversation will be available on attitudemag.com, and we'll email all registrants once the recording is up. Our next Mental Health Out Loud episode will be with Dr. William Dodson, and it's about de-escalating explosive emotions in dysregulated children and teens. And thank you so much, everyone. We really appreciate it.
For more Attitude podcasts and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.